They called me a budget burden and fired me right before the annual meeting. My pathetic hobby they mocked, it became the reason they'd have to call me their sole supplier and beg me to save their entire company. Did they forget how I once begged them? The garage where I tinkered with pressure sensors at 2 in the morning became my war room. The dismissal letter they handed me with a smirk became the blueprint for their downfall. They never saw it coming. The quiet engineer they discarded would become the one person standing between them and complete collapse. My name is Haley Monroe, and at 34, I'd spent the last 8 years as a systems engineer at Crystal Dynamics, a mid-sized tech company specializing in industrial robotics components. I wasn't the type to make waves. While others networked at happy hours and pitched themselves in meetings, I preferred the quiet hum of servers and the satisfaction of clean code running without errors. My desk sat in the corner of the third floor, surrounded by monitors displaying system diagnostics and performance metrics. I'd become the unofficial problem solver, the one people came to when their code wouldn't compile, or when the database threw mysterious errors at 3 in the morning. I never minded. Fixing things gave me purpose, even if no one remembered to thank me once their crisis passed. But the real work happened after hours, in my garage. While my neighbors thought I was just another suburban homeowner tinkering with cars, I was actually developing something that had consumed my thoughts for the past 2 years. An improved pressure sensor for industrial applications. The existing models on the market were bulky, prone to calibration drift, and expensive. Mine was smaller, more accurate, and could be manufactured at 60% of the cost. I'd started calling it my sanity project, something to keep my mind sharp when the corporate bureaucracy threatened to dull every creative edge I had. The garage had transformed into a makeshift lab. Oscilloscopes lined one wall, while 3D printers hummed on a workbench I'd built myself. Prototype sensors in various stages of completion covered every available surface. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night at 11:45 p.m. I'd been struggling with temperature compensation algorithms for months, but suddenly, the solution clicked. My hands shook as I ran the test sequence again. The readings held steady across the entire temperature range. After 2 years of failures, late nights, and more burnt coffee than I cared to remember, I had a working prototype. I incorporated Linux Embedded Systems LLC the following week. Just a formality, really a way to separate my personal finances from any potential business dealings. I never expected it to amount to much. Maybe a few sales here and there, enough to fund better equipment or justify the time spent away from Netflix and normal hobbies. The email from Junotech arrived on a Thursday afternoon while I was debugging a particularly nasty memory leak in Crystal's inventory system. I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam, but the subject line caught my eye. RE Linux Pressure Sensor Inquiry Prototype Approved. My heart stopped. Junotech was a major industrial distributor, the kind of company that could make or break a small supplier. I'd sent them a proposal 6 weeks earlier on a whim, never expecting a response. Now, Mitch Kowalski, their senior procurement manager, was requesting a meeting to discuss potential volume orders. I read the email 3 times, each word sinking in slowly. They'd tested my prototype. They liked what they saw. They wanted to talk numbers. That night, I sat in my garage, staring at the sensor that had consumed so many hours of my life. It looked insignificant, just a small metal cylinder with wire leads. But in that moment, it represented possibility. Maybe I wouldn't be just another engineer fixing other people's problems forever. Maybe this hobby could become something more. I should have been purely happy. Instead, a strange unease settled in my stomach. Crystal had strict policies about outside business activities. I'd been careful to keep everything separate, different email accounts. No use of company resources, all work done on my own time. But still, the corporate world had a way of claiming ownership over everything its employees touched. I pushed the worry aside. After all, I was good at being invisible. No one at Crystal paid attention to quiet Haley Monroe in her corner desk. As long as I kept fixing their problems and staying out of office politics, why would anyone care about my little garage project? That naive optimism would cost me everything, but it would also give me everything I never knew I wanted. Everything changed when Mark Callister arrived as our new CTO. He swept into Crystal Dynamics like a hurricane in a $1,000 suit, all sharp edges and corporate speak. Within his first week, he'd reorganized 3 departments and scheduled alignment meetings that felt more like interrogations. I'd managed to stay under his radar for the first month. My corner desk might as well have been in another building for all the attention he paid to it. But Mark had a particular talent for sniffing out what he called inefficiencies. And to him, a quiet female engineer who kept to herself was the biggest inefficiency of all. "Monroe," he'd bark whenever he passed my desk, like he was checking to make sure I was still there. "Still debugging, maybe we need someone faster in that position." I'd nod, return to my screen, and fix whatever crisis had emerged overnight. It became a routine, his condescension, my silence, the growing tension that made my jaw clench every morning when I badged in. The end came on a Wednesday at 2:15 p.m. I'd been so careful about keeping Linux separate from my work at Crestal. But a simple invoice from a component supplier had been misrouted. Instead of going to my personal email, it had somehow ended up in Crestal's system during a server migration I'd been overseeing. The invoice itself was innocuous, just a bill for electronic components I'd ordered for prototyping, but it had my company name on it, Linux Embedded Systems LLC. Mark called an impromptu team meeting in Conference Room B. 23 engineers packed into a space meant for 15, the smell of anxiety mixing with stale coffee. I knew something was wrong the moment I walked in. Mark stood at the head of the table, holding a printed copy of the invoice, his face wearing the satisfied smirk of a hunter who'd cornered his prey. "Team," he began, his voice dripping with false concern, "it's come to my attention that we have a serious breach of company policy." He held up the invoice, making sure everyone could see the Linux letterhead. "Ms. Monroe here has been running a side business, using company time, company resources, and company knowledge to compete against the very organization that pays her salary." My mouth went dry. That's not I never used company resources. Everything was done on my own time, in my own... Your own time. Mark's laugh was sharp, designed to cut. When you're a salaried employee, there is no your own time. Everything you create, every idea you have, belongs to Crestal Dynamics. It's in your employment agreement. Section 12, paragraph 4. The room was silent. I looked around at my colleagues, people I'd helped countless times, stayed late to fix their mistakes, covered for when they missed deadlines. Not one of them met my eyes. They all stared at their phones, the table, anywhere but at me. "But the real issue," Mark continued, warming to his theme, "is the deception, hiding this pathetic hobby of yours, pretending to be a team player while secretly building your own empire. It's not just against policy, it's a betrayal of trust." "It's a pressure sensor," I said quietly. "For industrial applications, it has nothing to do with Crestal's products." "Everything has to do with Crestal's products when you work here." He set the invoice on the table with theatrical precision. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal items. Any attempt to access company systems or contact clients will result in legal action." The next 20 minutes blurred together. The security guard, Jim, who I'd chatted with every morning for 8 years, wouldn't look at me as he stood by while I packed my desk into a cardboard box. My hands shook as I disconnected my personal items from my workstation. The photo of my parents, a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Engineer," a small succulent that had somehow survived the fluorescent lighting. As I walked through the floor, carrying my box of possessions like a cliché from a movie, I heard Mark's voice carrying from the conference room, "Let this be a lesson to everyone. Crestal Dynamics values loyalty above all else. We invest in team players, not mercenaries with pathetic hobbies." The parking lot felt impossibly bright after the dim office lighting. I sat in my car, box in the back seat, hands still gripping the steering wheel. 8 years reduced to a cardboard box, and a humiliation that burned in my chest like acid. My phone buzzed. A text from Devin, one of the junior engineers. "I'm sorry. That wasn't right." I deleted it without responding. Sorry didn't pay bills. Sorry didn't restore my reputation. Sorry was just another word for people who stood by and watched while someone else got destroyed. As I drove home at 2:45 p.m. on a Wednesday, a time when I should have been deep in code, I made myself a promise. Mark Callister thought he'd ended my career. He thought he'd put me in my place. He had no idea he'd just created his own worst nightmare, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The first week after my termination, I couldn't get out of bed before noon. The humiliation replayed in my mind like a broken record Mark's smirk. The invoice held high. 23 pairs of eyes avoiding mine. I'd spent 8 years building my reputation, and he'd destroyed it in 20 minutes. My savings would last 3 months, maybe 4 if I cut everything to the bone. The job market for systems engineers was decent, but word traveled fast in our industry. Who would hire someone terminated for breach of trust? My LinkedIn notifications had gone silent. Former colleagues who used to message me for advice now treated me like I was radioactive. By the second week, anger began to replace despair. I found myself in the garage at 3 a.m., staring at the pressure sensors that had cost me everything. Such small things to have caused such massive destruction. Part of me wanted to sweep them all into the trash, forget Linux ever existed, and crawl back to the corporate world with my tail between my legs. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the email from Mitch Kowalski at Juno Tech. His response to my termination news was surprisingly warm. Sorry to hear about the situation at Crestel. Corporate politics can be brutal. If you're still interested in moving forward with Linux, we're still interested in your sensors. In fact, this might work out better now you can focus on us full-time. Focus full-time. The words felt foreign. I'd always been someone's employee, always had the safety net of a steady paycheck. But as I sat in my garage, surrounded by the work I'd done in stolen hours, a different vision began to form. I incorporated Linux properly this time, not just as a side project, but as a real business license, tax ID, commercial bank account, the works. Each form I filled out felt like a small act of defiance. Mark thought he'd ended my pathetic hobby. Instead, he'd forced me to take it seriously. The real revelation came when I started researching Crestel's supply chain. 8 years of fixing their systems had given me an intimate knowledge of their vendors, their dependencies, their weak points. I knew which suppliers they relied on, which components were critical, which relationships were fragile. And then I found it buried in a procurement report I'd helped generate 6 months earlier. Crestel sourced 40% of their pressure sensors through Juno Tech, the same Juno Tech that was now eager to make me a primary supplier. I called Mitch that afternoon. Hypothetically, I said, choosing my words carefully, if Linux could meet your volume needs for industrial pressure sensors, would you consider making us a preferred vendor? Hypothetically, I could hear his smile through the phone. We're always looking to diversify our supplier base, especially when the supplier offers better specs at a lower price point. How soon could you scale up production? Give me 60 days. It was an insane promise. I had a garage full of prototypes and barely enough capital to last 3 months. But something had shifted inside me. The careful, quiet engineer who fixed everyone else's problems was gone. In her place was someone who understood that the best revenge wasn't loud or dramatic, it was systematic. I spent the next 2 weeks living on 4 hours of sleep. I negotiated with manufacturers, set up quality control processes, created fulfillment workflows. Every business book I'd ever ignored suddenly became essential reading. I hired a contract manufacturer who could handle the volume, using my prototype as the template. The beautiful part. My sensors were genuinely better than what Crestel was currently using. 30% more accurate, 40% cheaper to produce. This wasn't about sabotage, it was about building something superior and letting market forces do the rest. Devin reached out again 3 weeks after my termination. Hey, I know you probably don't want to hear from anyone at Crestel, but I thought you should know they're having major issues with sensor reliability. Mark's been screaming at vendors all week. I stared at the message for a long time before responding, "Thanks for letting me know. Hope you're doing well." Professional. Distant. No hint of the satisfaction that coursed through my veins. I pulled out a whiteboard and started mapping Crestel's supply chain from memory. Every vendor, every dependency, every critical path. If they got 40% of their sensors through Juno Tech, what other components might flow through similar channels? Who else might be interested in a better supplier? The garage had transformed into a war room. Whiteboards covered the walls, filled with flowcharts and timelines. I wasn't trying to destroy Crestel, that would be petty, obvious, the kind of revenge that made you look small. Instead, I was building something better, positioning myself exactly where they'd need me most. The best revenge is massive success, I wrote on the main whiteboard, but underneath, in smaller letters, I added, especially when they have to beg for it. My phone rang at 11:30 p.m. Mitch again. Haley, I've got good news. Our technical team finished evaluating your sensors. We want to move forward with a major contract. Are you sitting down? We're talking about being the primary supplier for our entire industrial automation division. I was standing in my garage, surrounded by the remnants of my pathetic hobby, wearing the same pajamas I'd worn for 3 days straight. I'm ready, I said, and for the first time since that Wednesday afternoon, I meant it. The beauty of understanding a system from the inside is knowing exactly where to apply pressure without leaving fingerprints. I didn't need to sabotage Crestel, I just needed to position myself where they were already vulnerable. My first major contract with Junotech went live 6 weeks after my termination. By then, I'd studied Crestel's procurement patterns like a chess master studying opponents' moves. They operated on just-in-time delivery, keeping minimal inventory to reduce costs. Smart in theory, catastrophic if your supply chain hiccuped. I started small. When Junotech's sales team mentioned they were updating their vendor relationships, I suggested a new fulfillment schedule that would optimize delivery windows. What I didn't mention was that this optimization would create a 3-day gap in sensor availability every month right when Crestel typically placed their emergency orders. It's just business efficiency, I told Mitch during our weekly call. Why maintain redundant inventory when we can predict demand patterns? He agreed. Why wouldn't he? My sensors were flying off their shelves, exceeding quality standards, and generating better margins than their previous suppliers. The first disruption was barely noticeable. Crestel's procurement team had to wait an extra 2 days for a rush order. Then their secondary supplier had a quality control issue that left them scrambling. Suddenly, the only available sensors were Linux models, sold through Junotech at a 15% premium for rush delivery. I kept meticulous records of every transaction, every delayed shipment that wasn't quite delayed enough to breach contract, every premium charged for expedited processing, all perfectly legal, all devastatingly effective. 3 months into my campaign, Devin sent another message. Something weird you might find interesting. We're having major supply chain issues, and your name keeps coming up in vendor conversations. Not sure if you know, but Linux sensors are now in about 40% of our products. 40%. I updated my whiteboard, circling the number. But the real intelligence came later in his message. Mark's been bragging about negotiating better terms with suppliers. He has no idea the new terms include dependency clauses that lock us in for 18 months. I smiled at my reflection in the dark garage window. Mark Callister, the brilliant CTO who'd exposed my pathetic hobby, had just signed contracts that would bind Crestel to supply chains I was quietly influencing. The next phase required more finesse. I reached out to other suppliers in the network companies that provided complementary components, businesses that relied on the same distribution channels. I wasn't trying to control them, just optimize their relationships. Have you considered consolidating your fulfillment? I'd suggest during industry meetups I'd started attending. Junotech has an excellent integrated supplier program, much more efficient than managing multiple vendors. One by one, smaller suppliers joined Junotech's network. Each brought their own products, their own relationships, their own tiny tentacles into Crestel's supply chain. Within 4 months, 68% of Crestel's critical components flowed through channels where Linux had preferred supplier status. The masterstroke came when I hired a supply chain analyst, someone who'd never heard of Crestel Dynamics or my history there. I tasked them with creating a vulnerability assessment for our major clients. Interesting finding? They told me during a meeting at my new office, a small space, but legitimately mine. One of Junotech's clients has a critical dependency on our supply network. 68% of their components come through channels where we have priority fulfillment. If we ever needed to adjust delivery schedules, they'd be significantly impacted. Which client? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Crestel Dynamics. Want me to flag this as a risk? No, I said, turning to face my whiteboard where I'd written a new phrase. The best trap is one they build themselves. Let's just monitor the situation. No need to create problems where none exist. That night, I worked until 3 a.m. updating delivery algorithms. Nothing malicious, just optimizations that favored clients who treated their suppliers as partners rather than expendable resources. Clients who paid on time, who maintained respectful relationships, who didn't terminate employees for having pathetic hobbies. Crestal would never know that their increasing delays, their rising costs, their frustrated customers all traced back to a series of perfectly legal business decisions made by a company they'd never heard of. They'd blame market forces, supply chain complexity, bad luck, everything except the quiet engineer they'd publicly humiliated. I kept a photo from my termination day on my desk, the cardboard box in my back seat, captured in my rearview mirror as I left Crestal's parking lot. Some might call it bitter. Holding on to that moment, I called it motivation. Every optimized delivery schedule, every strategic partnership, every percentage point of market share, they all led to one inevitable conclusion. Crestal Dynamics was about to learn that in modern business, you don't need to destroy your enemies. You just need to become indispensable to them. Then let them discover what that really costs. The first crack in Crestal's facade appeared on a Tuesday morning. Devon's message arrived at 7:45 a.m. Emergency all-hands meeting, 3 major clients threatening to cancel contracts, supply chain failures, Mark's losing it. I set my coffee down carefully, allowing myself exactly 30 seconds of satisfaction before returning to Linux's quarterly planning. The collapse had begun, and I hadn't lifted a finger to cause it directly. I'd simply optimized my business while Crestal had optimized themselves into a corner. By noon, the tech industry forums were buzzing. Anyone else having issues with Crestal Dynamics deliveries? Their promised ship dates are fiction at this point. Switching vendors can't afford these delays anymore. The beautiful irony was that every attempt Crestal made to fix the problem only tightened the noose. They tried to diversify suppliers, only to discover that most alternatives were already committed to other contracts I'd helped broker through strategic partnerships. They attempted to stockpile inventory, but their just-in-time system wasn't designed for storage, and the costs ate into their already thin margins. Week 2 brought desperation. Crestal's procurement team started making calls, trying to trace the source of their supply chain troubles. The trail was labyrinthine: suppliers connected to distributors, connected to other suppliers, all operating within their contracts, all mysteriously unable to prioritize Crestal's needs. Then came the phone call I'd been expecting. Linux Embedded Systems, Haley Monroe speaking. Silence. Then, Ms. Monroe. This is Sandra Williams from Crestal Dynamics Procurement. We've discovered that many of our critical components are now sourced through your preferred channels. I kept my voice professionally neutral. How can I help you, Ms. Williams? We need to discuss expanding our direct relationship with Linux. Our current situation is challenging. I appreciate your interest, but Linux operates exclusively through our distribution partners. Junotech handles all our client relationships. But surely, given the circumstances, I let the question hang. I'm not aware of any circumstances that would change our business model. If Crestal needs to adjust their procurement strategy, they're welcome to work through proper channels. The investigation that followed was almost comical. Mark personally led a task force to uncover what he called supply chain manipulation. They hired consultants, analyzed purchase orders, mapped vendor relationships. Every path led to the same conclusion: Linux Embedded Systems, operating completely legally through established distributors, had become integral to their supply network. The revelation came during a board meeting. According to Devon's increasingly frantic messages, when Mark finally presented his findings that the pathetic hobby he'd mocked now controlled the flow of 68% of their critical components, the CFO asked a simple question: how did we let ourselves become this dependent on a single supplier network? Mark's answer, Devon reported, was to blame predatory business practices. But the board saw it differently. They saw a CTO who'd failed to recognize a critical vulnerability, who'd signed contracts without understanding their implications, who'd fired an employee that went on to outmaneuver their entire procurement strategy. The customer defections accelerated. Crestal's stock price dropped 12% in a week. Emergency meetings became daily occurrences, and through it all, Linux's orders only grew. as companies fled Crestel's instability for more reliable suppliers. The final attempt at direct contact came at 9:30 p.m. on a Thursday. My phone showed Crestel's main number. Haley Monroe. Ms. Monroe, this is David Richardson, CEO of Crestel Dynamics. The CEO himself. I'd seen him maybe twice in my 8 years at the company, both times from across a crowded auditorium. Mr. Richardson, how can I help you? I believe you know why I'm calling. Your influence over our supply chain has become apparent. We need to discuss a resolution. With respect, Mr. Richardson, I'm not sure what you mean. Linux operates as an independent supplier. We fulfill our contracts, maintain our quality standards, and serve our distribution partners. If Crestel is experiencing challenges, perhaps you should examine your procurement strategies. Don't play games, Ms. Monroe. We know what you're doing. What I'm doing, I said, allowing the first hint of steel into my voice, is running a successful business, something I was prevented from doing while employed at Crestel. Now, if you need components, I suggest you contact Junotech. They handle all client relationships, as I've mentioned. This is restraint of trade. We'll pursue legal action. Please do. I'm sure the discovery process will be fascinating, particularly the part where you explain how a pathetic hobby managed to outmaneuver your entire procurement department while operating completely within the law. The line went silent. Is there anything else, Mr. Richardson? Mark Callister has been placed on administrative leave pending review. Now it was my turn for silence, not out of surprise, but to let him hear what his admission really meant that they'd thrown Mark under the bus, hoping it might appease me. I see. Well, I hope you find a suitable replacement. Good evening, Mr. Richardson. I hung up before he could respond. Outside my office window, the lights of the industrial district twinkled like stars. Somewhere among them, Crestel Dynamics was burning through emergency meetings, trying to solve a problem they'd created the day they decided my ambition was a threat rather than an asset. The collapse wasn't complete yet, but like a building with compromised foundations, the only question now was how fast it would fall. The recording surfaced on a Friday afternoon. I was reviewing production schedules when my phone exploded with notifications. Tech blogs, industry forums, LinkedIn, everyone was sharing the same audio clip. It was Mark's voice, crystal clear despite the slight phone distortion. From a call he'd made to Junotech 2 weeks before his suspension. Someone I never found out who had leaked it. Listen, we need to cut Linux out of the supply chain, Mark's voice demanded. I don't care what it costs. That company is run by a disgruntled ex-employee with a vendetta. Find alternative suppliers. Break contracts if you have to. I'll personally cover any penalties. Mitch's response was professional but firm. Mr. Callister, Linux is our highest performing supplier. Their quality metrics exceed anyone else in the market by 30%. We're not going to damage our business relationships based on your personal conflicts. This isn't personal. Really? Because you just said they're run by a disgruntled ex-employee. That sounds personal to me. The recording continued for another 3 minutes, Mark growing increasingly aggressive, threatening to pull Crestel's business, making barely veiled accusations about industrial sabotage. Each word dug his grave deeper. But the moment that went truly viral came near the end. Mark, frustrated by Mitch's refusals, spat out, "Fine, when this backfires, when you realize you're dealing with someone running a pathetic hobby out of their garage, don't come crying to me." Mitch's response was ice cold. That pathetic hobby has saved our clients over $2 million in the last quarter alone while delivering perfect quality scores. If that's pathetic, I'll take pathetic over professional incompetence any day. The tech world loves a David versus Goliath story, and this recording delivered, within hours. Pathetic hobby was trending. Engineers shared their own stories of corporate dismissal. Business analysts wrote pieces about supply chain vulnerability, and through it all, one line kept getting quoted and requoted. We reserve the right to refuse service to clients who terminate in bad faith. That was my response when Mark had called me directly, desperate and demanding priority treatment. Someone had recorded that too, though the audio quality suggested it might have been Mark himself, perhaps hoping to use it as evidence of anti-competitive behavior. Instead, It became a rallying cry for every small supplier who'd ever been bullied by a larger company. The memes started by evening. Mark's corporate headshot photoshopped onto failing businesses. Pathetic hobby merchandise appearing on entrepreneur websites. My favorite was a simple chart showing Lennox's growth curve intersecting with Crestel's decline, titled Hobbies versus Habits, a Case Study in Karma. I didn't comment on any of it. Didn't need to. The internet was doing my work for me, turning Mark into a cautionary